The reign of King Edward I of England was defined by conflict, administrative reform, and a powerful royal will. He was known as Longshanks due to his height, and more fearsomely as the Hammer of the Scots for his relentless campaigns against his northern neighbors. He was a formidable warrior and a serious ruler who had spent decades strengthening the English crown. His primary concern in his later years was securing this legacy. This legacy depended entirely on his son and heir, Edward of Carnarvon, who would become King Edward II. Unfortunately, the prince was a deep disappointment to his father. Edward II was not a warrior. He was born in Wales and was the first English prince to be formally invested as the Prince of Wales, but he showed no interest in the military arts. He also displayed no aptitude for the day-to-day business of governing. Contemporary chroniclers noted, with some disapproval, that the prince preferred unkingly activities. He enjoyed and was skilled in manual labor, such as digging ditches, thatching roofs, and shoeing horses. He also loved swimming, music, and theatricals. These pursuits were considered undignified and frivolous for a man who was expected to lead armies and hold a kingdom together. King Edward I was frustrated, and he tried to mold his son into a proper king, but his efforts failed. The central conflict was not just the prince's character, but the company he kept. His closest companion was a young knight from Gascony named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was of relatively minor nobility, but he had been a member of the prince's household from a young age. He was witty, fashionable, and exceptionally skilled in tournaments. He was also widely seen as arrogant and dismissive of the established English nobility. The bond between Prince Edward and Piers Gaveston was exceptionally close. Chroniclers described it as an immoderate or excessive love, and it was clear that Gaveston held an unparalleled influence over the future king. King Edward I saw this relationship as a direct threat. He believed Gaveston was a corrupting influence who distracted the prince from his duties. He also feared that Gaveston's ambition would destabilize the kingdom once the prince took the throne. In 1307, the old king's patience ran out. He held a public confrontation where he reportedly tore hair from his son's head. He then banished Gaveston from the kingdom. To ensure the separation was permanent, Edward I forced his son to swear a solemn oath on holy relics that he would never, under any circumstances, recall Gaveston. This was the king's final attempt to control his son and protect the realm. Shortly after this event, in July 1307, King Edward I died. He died on campaign near the Scottish border, still trying to subdue Robert the Bruce. With his father's death, the 23-year-old prince was now King Edward II of England. His authority was, for the first time, absolute. The very first decision he made as king demonstrated his priorities. He broke the sacred oath he had sworn to his father. He immediately sent a message to Piers Gaveston, who was in exile in France, and recalled him to England. This single act set the tone for his entire reign. It was a direct affront to his father's memory and a clear signal to the powerful English barons. When Gaveston returned, the king's joy was obvious. He immediately began to shower his favorite with lands, titles, and money. The most significant of these gifts was the earldom of Cornwall. This was not a minor honor. The earldom of Cornwall was one of the wealthiest and most powerful titles in the kingdom, traditionally reserved for senior members of the royal family. To give it to a low-born Gascon knight was seen as a profound insult by the entire English aristocracy. The barons, who had served Edward I for decades, were instantly alienated. These were serious and powerful men, such as Henry de Lacy, Earl of Lincoln, and Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. The king's own cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, was the richest and most powerful nobleman in England. These men expected to be the king's natural advisors. Instead, they found themselves ignored.
all power and access to the king were controlled by Piers Gaveston. Gaveston's personality only made the situation worse. He did not try to build alliances or show respect. He openly flaunted his wealth and his closeness to the king. He was known for his sharp wit, which he used to mock the great lords of the realm. He gave them insulting nicknames that struck at their dignity. The powerful Earl of Warwick, Guy de Beauchamp, was called the Black Dog of Arden. Thomas of Lancaster, a man of immense pride, was called the Fiddler or the Churl. These insults were not forgotten. They fostered a deep personal hatred that went beyond mere political disagreement. This created an immediate political crisis. The king was isolating himself from the men whose support he needed to rule. He was placing his personal affection for one man above the stability of his entire kingdom. This was a dangerous path. The king also had another pressing duty. He was obligated to fulfill a diplomatic agreement arranged by his father. This was his marriage to Isabella, the daughter of the King of France. This political marriage, intended to secure peace, would soon become another major source of conflict and humiliation.
In January 1308, King Edward II traveled to France for his wedding. He was to marry Isabella, the daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France. This was a major diplomatic event meant to solidify peace between the two kingdoms. Isabella was only 12 years old and was already known as the Beauty of France. The marriage was a political arrangement, but even by those standards, Edward's behavior was shocking. He brought Piers Gaveston with him to France for the wedding ceremonies. At the celebrations, Edward focused his attention almost exclusively on Gaveston. Chroniclers reported that Edward gave many of the magnificent wedding gifts he received from the King of France directly to Gaveston. This was a grave insult to his new bride and to the entire French court. The King of France was reportedly furious. When the royal party returned to England for the coronation in February, the situation became even worse. A coronation was the most sacred and important ceremony of a king's reign. It was meant to display the unity and hierarchy of the kingdom. Instead, Edward used it to elevate his favorite. Piers Gaveston was given the honor of carrying St. Edward's crown, one of the most prominent roles in the procession. He dressed for the occasion in royal purple velvet, a color reserved for the king himself. Reports from the ceremony claimed he was so covered in jewels that he outshone the king. At the coronation banquet that followed, King Edward II spent the entire time talking, laughing, and showing affection to Gaveston. He almost completely ignored his new queen, Isabella. He also ignored her powerful French uncles, who had traveled from Paris for the event. This public humiliation was too much. Two of Isabella's uncles were so disgusted by the king's behavior and the insult to their niece that they left the banquet. They immediately returned to France. This was now an international scandal. The English barons were incandescent with rage. They saw the king's behavior as a complete breakdown of royal dignity. He was making a fool of himself and his kingdom. They decided they had to act. Just a few months after the coronation, the barons formed a united front. They came to the king and delivered an ultimatum. Piers Gaveston must be banished from the kingdom. This was not a request. It was an order backed by the implied threat of civil war. Edward II was furious, but he was powerless. He had no allies. He was forced to agree. In May 1308, he signed a document agreeing to exile Gaveston. To lessen the blow, Edward made Gaveston the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. This was technically an exile, as it was across the sea, but it was also a very powerful and lucrative position, which showed the barons that the king was not truly punishing his favorite. Gaveston went to Ireland, where he actually proved to be a competent and effective military administrator. Back in England, King Edward II was miserable. He was separated from his favorite and surrounded by the barons he now hated. He immediately began working to secure Gaveston's return. He sent a constant stream of letters to the Pope asking for him to nullify the exile oath. He also began to negotiate with the barons one by one. He tried to buy their support by making huge grants of land and power. He made major concessions to the most powerful lords, especially his cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. His efforts eventually worked. He managed to divide the baronial opposition. In 1309, he secured an agreement. Gaveston was allowed to return to England. The king was overjoyed. The reunion was celebrated with massive tournaments and feasts. The barons, however, watched and waited. They soon discovered that their fears were justified. Piers Gaveston had learned absolutely nothing from his exile. He returned to court just as arrogant, greedy, and dismissive as before. He immediately resumed his old habit of insulting the powerful lords. He sidelined the barons and once again dominated the king. The barons felt they had been tricked. They had given the king what he wanted, and he had broken his promises. They realized they needed a more permanent solution. They formed a new committee, which was even more powerful than the last. This group was known as the Lords Ordainers. This committee included the most powerful men in the realm, including Thomas of Lancaster and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Their task was not just to remove Gaveston, but to write a new set of rules to reform the entire government. This was a direct challenge to the king's authority. For over a year, the Lords Ordainers worked. In 1311, they presented their document, the Ordinances of 1311. This was a long list of sweeping reforms. It limited the king's ability to raise taxes, restricted his spending, and demanded that he appoint officials only with the consent of the barons in Parliament. Buried within these reforms was the article the barons cared about most. Article 20 stated that Piers Gaveston was to be exiled from all English lands forever. The document listed his crimes, accusing him of giving evil counsel to the king and removing the king's heart from his people. This time, there was no negotiation. The ordinances were the law. The barons had the full support of Parliament and the Church. King Edward II was cornered. He had to sign the document. He was forced to personally agree to the permanent banishment of his favorite. Gaveston was given a deadline. He had to leave England by November 1st. If he ever returned, he would be declared an outlaw and an enemy of the kingdom. Anyone would have the right to hunt him down and kill him. Gaveston left England and went to Flanders. Edward was devastated, and the kingdom waited to see what the king would do next.
King Edward II had been forced to sign the ordinances of 1311. He had agreed to the permanent exile of Piers Gaveston, but he had no intention of obeying the law. He was simply biding his time. He waited until the barons and their private armies had dispersed from London. He waited until they had returned to their own estates. He then acted in open defiance of the law he had just signed. In early 1312, just a few months after Gaveston's departure, Edward recalled him. This was an unbelievably reckless act. It was a direct violation of the ordinances and, in effect, a declaration of war against the Lords Ordainers. The barons were stunned by the king's audacity. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and Gaveston's mortal enemy, immediately began to raise his army.
army. Other barons like the Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog of Arden, did the same. This was no longer a political dispute. It was a manhunt. The king and Gaveston knew they were in mortal danger. They fled north, trying to gather supporters, but few were willing to fight for the king and his hated favorite. The king and Gaveston were essentially fugitives within their own kingdom. They eventually took refuge in Scarborough Castle. This was a formidable royal fortress perched on a high cliff overlooking the North Sea. It was difficult to assault. The armies of the barons, led by Lancaster, Pembroke, and Warwick, arrived and surrounded the castle. The king was trapped. At this point, Edward made a decision that sealed Gaveston's fate. He told Gaveston to hold the castle, promising he would be safe there. Edward then claimed he was leaving to raise a new army to rescue him. Under the cover of darkness, King Edward II abandoned his favorite. He slipped out of the castle and fled south, leaving Gaveston to face the barons alone. Gaveston was a good knight, but he was not a great commander. He only had a small garrison and his supplies were low. The siege of Scarborough lasted only a few weeks. Gaveston was forced to surrender. He negotiated his surrender specifically with the Earl of Pembroke. Pembroke was known as a moderate. He disliked Gaveston, but he was a man of honor. Pembroke gave Gaveston his word as a knight that he would not be harmed. The agreement was that Gaveston would be taken into custody and held until Parliament could meet to decide his ultimate fate. Gaveston surrendered and was placed in Pembroke's custody. Pembroke began taking him south. They stopped for the night at an inn. In an incredible moment of negligence, Pembroke decided to leave Gaveston under guard. He left to visit his wife, who was staying nearby. That night, the Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog, arrived at the inn with his own soldiers. Warwick was not a moderate, and he had made no promises. He despised Gaveston. He seized Gaveston, put him in chains, and dragged him away. This was an illegal kidnapping. Warwick took Gaveston to his own fortress, Warwick Castle. There, the other hostile barons, including Thomas of Lancaster, were waiting. They held what was essentially a mock trial. Gaveston was not allowed to speak in his own defense. They read the list of his crimes as outlined in the ordinances. He was found guilty of treason. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The sentence was death. They did not even grant him a formal execution. They dragged him out of the castle to a nearby place called Blacklow Hill. There, without priest present, they had their soldiers run him through with a sword. He was then beheaded. His body was left unburied. When King Edward II heard the news, he was completely shattered. He was consumed by grief and an incandescent rage. His favorite had been captured, kidnapped, and murdered by his own barons. This was an act he would never forgive. He would spend the rest of his life obsessed with getting revenge on the men responsible, especially his cousin Thomas of Lancaster. In the short term, however, the king was powerless. The barons had won. They had their armies, and they had eliminated their rival. Edward was forced into a humiliating public reconciliation. He had to officially pardon the men who had just murdered his best friend. While Edward was focused on his personal drama, a much larger crisis was unfolding. Robert the Bruce had been methodically reconquering Scotland. He had taken back every castle and town his father, Edward I, had captured. The English barons were too busy fighting over Gaveston to pay attention. By 1314, only Stirling Castle remained in English hands. Edward II was finally shamed into acting like a king, and he gathered a massive English army, the largest in decades, to relieve the siege of Stirling. He and Thomas of Lancaster were forced to be co-commanders despite their mutual hatred. In June 1314, this dysfunctional army met the smaller, better-led Scottish army at the Battle of Bannockburn. The result was the single greatest military disaster in English history. Robert the Bruce's tactics were brilliant. The English command structure was chaotic. The English cavalry was
trapped, and the infantry was slaughtered. The entire army dissolved. King Edward II himself had to be dragged from the battlefield, fleeing for his life. He had lost Scotland. He returned to England completely defeated and humiliated, a failure as a king. For the next several years, the kingdom drifted. Edward sulked, and Thomas of Lancaster, the murderer of Gaveston, effectively ruled England.
The years immediately following the disaster at Bannockburn were a low point for King Edward II. He was a defeated king. He had lost Scotland, and he was completely overshadowed at home by his hated cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. Lancaster, as the leader of the victorious baronial faction, essentially controlled the government. He enforced the ordinances and treated the king with contempt. England suffered during this period. There was a great famine, and the Scots raided the north of England without opposition. Edward II was king in name only. He was politically isolated, and he spent these years in a quiet, bitter depression. But Edward II had not learned his lesson about favorites. He was a man who seemed incapable of ruling alone. He needed a close, trusted companion to guide him. Since Gaveston was gone, he eventually found new ones. This time, it was a package deal. Hugh Despenser the Elder and his son, Hugh Despenser the Younger. The father was an experienced royal administrator. The son, Hugh the Younger, was different. He was cold, calculating, efficient, and pathologically greedy. He was, in many ways, the opposite of Piers Gaveston. Gaveston had been charming but politically inept. Despenser was charmless but politically brilliant. Around 1318, Hugh Despenser the Younger became the king's chamberlain. He used this position to gain total, intimate access to Edward II. Just as he had with Gaveston, the king began to shower Hugh the Younger with affection, gifts, and power. The king became completely dependent on him, but the Despensers had a different goal than Gaveston. Gaveston wanted glory and the king's love. The Despensers wanted land, wealth, and total power. They were systematic. They used their influence with the king to enrich themselves at an alarming rate. Their primary ambition was to build a massive family territory in the Welsh Marches. They began to acquire lordships and castles from other barons. They used a combination of threats, legal manipulation, and outright extortion. They would use the king's authority to bully other lords into giving up their land. If a baron refused, he might suddenly find himself facing trumped-up criminal charges or a massive, unpayable royal fine. The Despensers were far more dangerous than Gaveston ever was. Gaveston had merely insulted the barons. The Despensers were actively stealing from them. The Marcher lords, the powerful barons who controlled the Welsh border, were the first to feel the pressure. This group included men like Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. By 1321, these barons had seen enough. They realized the Despensers were a threat to their property and their lives. They did what the barons always did. They raised their armies and rebelled. This conflict became known as the Despenser War. The Marcher lords, including Mortimer, went on a rampage. They specifically attacked and burned Despenser lands. They were careful to state that they were not rebelling against the king. They were only attacking his evil advisors, a classic medieval legal loophole. The rebellion was swift and successful. The Marcher lords marched on London. They were joined by other disaffected barons, including the still powerful Thomas of Lancaster. The kingdom was on the brink of civil war again. In London, they forced the king and Parliament to act. King Edward II, just as he had with Gaveston, was forced to back down. He was publicly humiliated. He had to sign an order banishing both Hugh Despenser the Elder and Hugh Despenser the Younger from the kingdom. It seemed that history was repeating itself. But something in Edward II had changed. He was older. He was filled with a decade of resentment. He was tired of being humiliated by his barons. He waited for
for his moment. It came just a few months later. A minor dispute occurred where the wife of a royal official was refused entry to Leeds Castle, which was controlled by one of the rebel barons. Edward II seized on this minor event as a profound insult to his royal authority. For the first time in his life, he acted with decisive, ruthless energy. He raised an army. He declared the baron at Leeds Castle a traitor. Then he recalled the Despensers from their exile. He declared war on the Marcher lords. Edward II, guided by the ruthless Despensers, finally acted like his father. He led his army in a swift and brutal campaign. He caught the Marcher lords, including Mortimer, by surprise. He defeated them and forced their surrender. Mortimer was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Edward II did not stop. He took his victorious army north. He was hunting for the man he hated most in the world, his cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. In March 1322, the royal army cornered Lancaster at the Battle of Burrow Bridge. The battle was a decisive victory for the king. Thomas of Lancaster was captured. Edward II finally had his revenge. 10 years after the murder of Piers Gaveston, the king had his killer in chains. He transported Lancaster to his own castle. He held a mock trial, just as Lancaster had done to Gaveston. Lancaster was not allowed to speak. He was found guilty of treason. Edward II sentenced him to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. As a mercy for his royal blood, the sentence was commuted to a simple beheading. Edward II forced his cousin to die the same death he had given Piers. With this single act, Edward II's world was transformed. His greatest enemy was dead. His other rivals were in prison. He and the Despensers were in total control. They immediately summoned a parliament. They passed the Statute of York, which formally revoked the ordinances of 1311 forever. The king's power was now absolute. For the next 4 years, England was ruled by King Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger. It was a brutal tyranny. The Despensers were paranoid and cruel. They stole more land, executed their enemies, and created a vast network of spies. They were universally hated. They had defeated all their enemies except one. They had forgotten about the Queen, Isabella.
Queen Isabella of France had endured a difficult and humiliating life in England. She had arrived as a 12-year-old child, full of the pride of the French royal house. She was immediately and publicly shamed at her own coronation by her husband and his favorite, Piers Gaveston. She had been forced to watch as her husband gave his affection and the kingdom's wealth to another man. She deeply hated Gaveston. She had even secretly worked with the barons, including her future lover Roger Mortimer, to try and bring about Gaveston's downfall. After Gaveston's execution, her relationship with Edward II had stabilized for a time. They were not a loving couple, but they were a functional one. She fulfilled her primary duty as queen. She gave Edward II 4 children, including a healthy and promising heir, the future King Edward III. For a few years, she was treated with the respect she deserved as queen. But this period of stability ended with the rise of the Despensers. Isabella loathed Hugh Despenser the Younger. She hated him even more than she had hated Gaveston. Gaveston had been an arrogant fool, but Despenser was a cold and calculating tyrant. He was not just a rival for the king's affection, he was a direct threat to the queen herself. Hugh Despenser saw Isabella as a potential center of opposition. He understood that disaffected barons might rally around her. Therefore, he began a systematic campaign to isolate her. He used his complete control over King Edward II to turn the king against his wife. He
He convinced Edward that Isabella, being French, could not be trusted. The king and Despenser began to strip her of her power and dignity. They confiscated her lands and estates, claiming they needed the income for the good of the kingdom. They arrested members of her household staff, accusing them of being spies for France. They even, by some reports, restricted her access to her own children. Isabella was no longer the Queen of England in any meaningful way. She was a prisoner in her own court. She was powerless, isolated, and consumed by a cold anger. She was waiting for any opportunity to escape. In 1325, that opportunity arrived. A diplomatic crisis emerged with France. Isabella's brother, Charles IV, was now the King of France. He had a dispute with Edward II over the territory of Gascony, which was controlled by the English king. The dispute escalated into a small-scale conflict known as the War of St. Sardos. A peace treaty was needed. Someone from England had to go to Paris to negotiate with King Charles IV. King Edward II could not go. Hugh Despenser the Younger would not go. Despenser was so paranoid that he refused to leave the king's side. He was terrified that if he left England, even for a week, his enemies would rise up and destroy him. Queen Isabella saw her chance. She made a proposal. She suggested that she should go to Paris. She argued that she was the perfect diplomat. She was the Queen of England, and she was also the sister of the King of France. Who could be better to negotiate a family peace? King Edward II and Hugh Despenser thought this was a brilliant idea. It would get the troublesome queen out of the country. They believed she was powerless and that they could control her from afar. In March 25, they sent Queen Isabella to Paris with a full diplomatic entourage. It was the single greatest miscalculation of their lives. They had willingly sent the person who hated them most in the world to the one place where she would be completely safe and powerful. Isabella arrived at the French court. She was no longer a prisoner. She was the beloved sister of the king. She was home. She quickly and skillfully negotiated a peace treaty with her brother. The treaty was reasonable, but it had one crucial condition. To finalize the peace, the heir to the English throne, 13-year-old Prince Edward, had to come to Paris. He needed to pay homage to King Charles IV for the lands in Gascony. Back in England, Hugh Despenser panicked. He sensed a trap. He begged Edward II not to send the heir. He argued that if Isabella got her hands on the prince, she would never return. But King Edward II for once overruled his favorite. He just wanted the French problem to be over. He thought it was a simple formality. He sent Prince Edward to Paris to join his mother. The prince arrived. The ceremony was completed. The peace was sealed. King Edward II then sent a message to Paris. He ordered his wife and son to come home. Isabella's reply changed the course of English history. She refused. She sent a public message back to her husband. She declared that she would not return to England. She also stated that she was keeping the heir, Prince Edward. She announced that she would not set foot in England as long as that man, Hugh Despenser, stood between her and her husband. This was an open declaration of rebellion. Isabella had the heir. She had the protection of the King of France. Edward and Despenser were furious, but they were helpless. Isabella then found a new, powerful ally. Other English exiles who hated the Despensers had fled to Paris. One of these men was Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was the baron who had started the Despenser War. He had been captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, but he had recently performed a daring escape. He was charismatic, ruthless, and he wanted revenge. He and Isabella met. They soon became inseparable. They became lovers. Together, they started to plot. They started to raise money and hire mercenaries. They were planning to return to England, not as diplomats, but as invaders.
Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer were in Paris, openly living as lovers and planning their invasion. Their actions scandalized the French court, and eventually Isabella's brother, King Charles IV, was pressured to ask his sister to leave. Isabella and Mortimer, along with the young Prince Edward, traveled to the court of William, Count of Hainaut. There, Isabella secured her invasion force. She betrothed her son, Prince Edward, to the Count's daughter, Philippa. In exchange, the Count gave her ships and a small army of mercenaries. It was not a large force, perhaps only 1,500 soldiers. In September 1326, Isabella, Mortimer, and the 14-year-old heir landed on the coast of England. King Edward II and Hugh Despenser knew they were coming. They had the entire royal army and the defenses of the kingdom at their command. The invasion should have been easily crushed. It was not. The landing was an immediate and total success. The entire kingdom was a powder keg of hatred for the Despenser regime, and Isabella's arrival was the spark. Absolutely no one wanted to fight for King Edward II. The moment Isabella landed, the great barons of the realm, including the king's own brother, the Earl of Kent, and Henry of Lancaster, brother of the executed Thomas, defected to her side. The common people rose up in her support. The city of London rioted and opened its gates to her, capturing and beheading Hugh Despenser the Elder. Edward's entire government dissolved in a matter of days. It simply melted away. King Edward II and Hugh Despenser the Younger were left with only a handful of followers. They did the only thing they could. They ran. They fled London and raced toward Wales, where the Despensers had their personal castles. It was a pathetic flight, a repeat of the king's earlier escape with Gaveston. This time, there was no escape. They were hunted down and captured in South Wales. The king and his hated favorite were now prisoners. Hugh Despenser the Younger was not treated as a political prisoner. He was treated as a monster. Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella wanted to make an example of him. He was charged with treason. His execution was one of the most brutal in English history. He was dragged through the streets. He was hung, but cut down while still alive. He was then publicly mutilated and emboweled. His entrails were burned in front of him before he was finally beheaded and his body chopped into quarters. The crowds reportedly cheered. This left the problem of the king. Edward II was still the anointed king. He could not be publicly butchered like Despenser. He was a political and constitutional crisis. He was taken to Kenilworth Castle and held as a prisoner. Isabella and Mortimer were now ruling the country as regents in the name of Prince Edward. But as long as Edward II was still technically the king, he was a threat. Someone could try to rescue him. In January 1327, a delegation from Parliament was sent to the king. They read him a long list of his crimes and failures, his incompetence, his loss of Scotland, his elevation of evil favorites, and his breaking of his coronation oath. They delivered an ultimatum. He could either abdicate his throne in favor of his son, or Parliament would disinherit both him and his son and place a new family on the throne. Edward II, weeping, was broken. He agreed to abdicate. His crown was formally removed. His 14-year-old son was proclaimed King Edward III. The former king, now just Edward of Caernarvon,
was still a problem. He was moved to Berkeley Castle and kept under guard. As long as he was alive, he was a potential rallying point for a counter-rebellion. Isabella and Mortimer needed him gone. In September 1327, about 8 months after his abdication, it was announced that the former king had died. The official cause was natural causes, following a sudden illness. No one believed it. A dark and gruesome legend quickly spread about the how of his death. The story whispered in chronicles was that he had been murdered in a way that would leave no marks. It was said that his killers, acting on Mortimer's orders, pinned him down. They supposedly inserted a hollow horn into his rectum and then shoved a red-hot iron poker through it, burning him to death from the inside. This story served as a symbolic punishment for his unnatural relationships. Historians today doubt this account. It is more likely that he was simply quietly suffocated with a mattress. But the story of the poker is what was remembered. Isabella and Roger Mortimer ruled England as regents for 3 years. They proved to be just as greedy and arrogant as the Despensers. Mortimer became immensely wealthy and began to act like a king himself. But the young King Edward III was not his father. He was his grandfather, Longshanks, reborn. He had watched all of this. In 1330, at the age of 17, he staged his own daring coup. He led a small band of loyal friends through a secret tunnel into Nottingham Castle. He arrested Mortimer in front of his mother. He had him charged with treason and quickly hanged. He spared his mother, Queen Isabella, but forced her into a comfortable and permanent retirement. The long, disastrous, and tragic reign of King Edward II and the chaos it created was finally over.